The first direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was the Berlin Airlift. Now, as I said in the previous segment, communism simply does not work in the long run. And this became apparent as West Germany began to prosper and East Germany did not. And this also applied to the city of Berlin. West Berlin, which was controlled by the United States, Great Britain, and France, began to prosper, and East Berlin did not. And Joseph Stalin became determined that he was going to make West Berlin fail. So he decided to cut off all railroads and all highways leading into West Berlin. And the point of this was he was going to slowly starve the people of West Berlin. If you don't have food, then obviously your government is going to fail because you're going to all starve. Well, President Truman refused to give up on the people of Berlin. It was during this time period that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed, or for short, NATO. Now, this was simply a group of nations. The United States was a member, Great Britain was a member, France and Canada were both members, and about 8 other countries all joined together and promised that if one of the NATO countries were attacked, then the other members would come to their aid. And I think the fact that NATO was formed during this time period goes to show just how close some people thought we were to war. But President Truman was able to prevent the Berlin blockade from turning into a war. He decided, if I can't send supplies to Berlin using the railroad and I can't send supplies using the highway, I'll use an airlift. So for the next 15 months, for over a year, the United States and Great Britain used their air force to bring supplies in the West Berlin. And after a 15-month period, Stalin finally backed down and he removed the blockades. And so President Truman was able to stand up to the Soviet Union without causing a direct armed conflict between the two countries. Now, 1949 was a very scary year for the United States for a couple of reasons. One, that year the Soviet Union managed to develop an atomic bomb. A couple of American planes were flying over the North Pacific Ocean and detected radioactive material in the atmosphere, and were able to determine that an atomic bomb had been exploded in Siberia, which is part of the Soviet Union. And the fact that the Soviet Union had an atomic bomb was scary for a couple of reasons. One, now the US and the Soviet Union had atomic weapons, so if war did break out between those two countries, it would be a nuclear war. What else made this so scary was the US before this had been the only country with an atomic weapon. So how did the Soviet Union figure out how to do this? Did they have spies in the United States? This was something that was very scary to the American people. Also in 1949, China fell to communism. There had been a civil war raging in China since 1927. A communist army led by Mao Zedong managed to defeat the non-communist nationalist army led by Chiang Kai-shek. And keep in mind, the goal of the United States during the Cold War was to prevent the spread of communism. And now China has been taken over and is now being ruled by a communist government. So not only has the United States failed to stop the spread of communism, but they've allowed communism to spread into China, which is a huge nation. So this seems like a huge setback for the United States. As the country moved into the 1950s, there was a very strong sense of suspicion that there were communist spies within the United States. And this led to what we call the Second Red Scare. You should remember the first Red Scare from the end of World War I. There was a big fear that a communist had infiltrated the United States and were trying to overthrow the American government. And the same thing begins to happen in the early 1950s. In the House of Representatives, there is the House of Un-American Activities Committee. So this is a committee that had been investigating both communist and fascist since before World War II. But during the 1950s, they actually start to hold public hearings. They're actually televised. People are able to watch these on a TV. So these hearings only help kind of spread this sense of paranoia that there's spies amongst us. Two very famous cases brought before the House of Un-American Activities Committee was the case of the Hollywood 10 and Alger Hiss. I'll allow you to read up on those on your own. Probably the two most famous cases from this time period is the Rosenbergs and McCarthyism. Let's start with the Rosenbergs. So Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were a married couple who were accused of selling government secrets to the Soviet Union. And they actually went to trial, were convicted, and were executed for this. Now, later, it was proved that Mr. Rosenberg had been involved in giving government secrets to the Soviet Union, but his wife had actually been innocent. So they executed an innocent woman in this case. And then McCarthyism. So Senator Joseph McCarthy was a senator from the state of Wisconsin, and he was looking for a way to accumulate power. And he decided, why don't I act like I have some knowledge that nobody else does about communists in the United States? So he gives a speech claiming that he has a list of over 200 communists in the U.S. State Department. Remember, the State Department is the department of the American government that deals with our relationship with other countries. Now, eventually, he did bite off more than he could chew, and he accused the army of being full of communists, and that did not go over very well, and he was voted out of office. But at first, this proved very scary. This simply reinforced people's fears that the United States was being infiltrated by communists. Also in 1950, the same year that Senator McCarthy gave his speech claiming that there were a communist in the State Department, North Korea invaded South Korea. Now, what does this have to do with the Cold War? After World War II, the Korean Peninsula had been split into two sections, and the northern section had been given to the Soviet Union, they had set up a communist government led by a guy named Kim Il sung, while the southern half had been given to the United States, and they had set up a non communist government there led by a dictator named Syngman Rhee. And in June of 1950, communist North Korea invaded non-communist South Korea. Now, for the reason for the invasion was both countries, North Korea and South Korea, wanted to reunite their nation under a single government. They did not want a North Korea and a South Korea. They wanted just a Korea. The problem was North Korea thought that it should be under a communist government, and South Korea thought it should be under a non-communist government. So when North Korea invaded South Korea, most Americans believed that this had been done on orders from the Soviet Union, that this was part of the Soviet Union's plot to spread communism around the world. The United Nations, the group that had been set up to prevent another world war, decided that it would send troops to help South Korea, and as the leader of the United Nations troops, they chose General Douglas MacArthur, who was a hero of World War II. Now, very quickly, let's look at this map on the next page. So, when North Korea invaded South Korea, they managed to take control. First of all, the North Koreans captured the South Korean capital of Seoul, and they managed to take control of the entire nation of South Korea, except for a section known as the Pusan Perimeter, the section that is located within this dotted line. When General MacArthur and the UN forces arrived, MacArthur launched an invasion at the city of Incheon. He managed to capture the city of Incheon, recapture the city of Seoul, and as his troops moved in from behind, other UN troops broke out from the Pusan perimeter and marched northward, and they managed to push all of the North Korean troops out of South Korea. But they did not end there. Once they got to the 38th parallel, they decided to invade North Korea. They captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang, and they seized everything. I mean, it was essentially a reversal of what had already happened. They seized the entire country of North Korea except for the sections above this dotted line. Here is where things got complicated. Remember, China, which is just north of North Korea, is now a communist nation. China began to grow nervous as the UN forces got closer and closer to the Chinese border. And so in November of 1950, Chinese troops began to cross the border and attack the UN troops. There was a massive battle here at the Chosin Reservoir, and after that battle, the UN forces actually retreated back into South Korea. They managed to hold a line that you see here at the dotted line, and General MacArthur started to urge President Truman to actually use nuclear weapons against China. Truman refused to do this, and MacArthur started to essentially badmouth the president. And in April of 1951, Truman fired MacArthur.